Well, good evening. My name's Roger Stocker. I'm the branch chair of the IWA West London branch. And I was saying earlier to Adam that I do vaguely remember he came along to the Middlesex IWA branch meeting to discuss the same topic. He assures me that he's updated it since then. I think probably the Huddersfield Narrow has opened since then as well, but no, maybe not quite. And I think at that evening there were around, I think it was about 20 people there. So given this year, with all the problem with water shortages and issues around reservoirs, I thought this might be an ideal way to actually discuss how CRT deals with its water services, and invited him along. So Adam Comerford is the National Hydrology Manager, and as it can be a fairly dry topic, that was a play on words that I just made up myself. I thought if we complemented that with a little bit of engineering, which is always really exciting. So invited Neil Owen to come along and talk about some of the issues that we find on the waterways and some of the issues that people moan about. I've promised not to talk too much about leaky gates on the Grand Union South. Well, maybe only for about 10-15 minutes. But anyway, if we kick off, and I'll hand the baton over to Adam, who will talk about water everywhere, and maybe some to drink, perhaps, if moving water around the country ever becomes a thing. Adam.
Brilliant. Thanks, Roger, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to talk to you this evening. I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully you should now see a slide. I can see Roger, hopefully, or someone can say yes, they can see it, and then we can get started. So, as Roger's introduced me, I'm National Hydrology Manager for the Canal and River Trust. I've worked for the Trust and British Waterways for over 20 years now, apart from a short spell working for the Environment Agency. And the title of my presentation is Too Little, Too Much, and Just Right, How We Get Water Management, hopefully, just right, as much of the time as possible. And I've got quite a few slides to run through, both what happens when we have too little water and at the other end of the spectrum, what happens when we have flooding. My presentation will include a couple of video clips as well, so hopefully those will work well for you to all see. So without further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about celebrating 10 years of the Trust, a little bit of a plug for all the work that I think a lot of you will be aware of, but this as a short video to introduce things. I'll talk a bit about canal hydrology, focus a lot on what we do most of the time, which is all about water resource management. And I'll touch on some of the recent issues we've had, particularly this summer with the drought issues. I'll then go on to talk a little bit about what happens when we have too much water, which probably will be not far away if weather patterns start to carry on as they are, and some of the issues we've had with excessive water in our system. And then really just wrap it up with some closing remarks and a summary and a chance for questions. And then I'll hand over to Neil. So if I just get this slide started, it's a short presentation. You may have seen if you attended the Trust annual public meeting, but I'll run it anyway. It's only a couple of minutes, so please sit back and enjoy this one.
More than 200 years ago, great engineers and thousands of navvies made something truly spectacular. They achieved feats of industrial engineering never encountered before, taking water up hills, across valleys, powering the industrial age. When they were creating this 2,000-mile network, the finest example of industrial heritage in the world, they could never have predicted the role that canals would still be playing in our lives over 2 centuries later. Stretching from London to Lancaster, Brecon to Boston, the former motorways of the nation are continuing to shape the lives of millions of people today, but in new, completely different and exciting ways. They're giving us somewhere we can live, relax, visit, get active, spend time together, get close to nature. Today there are more boats and people on the water than ever before. Our canals are not just about the past. They have the potential to help power our future too. They provide a vital source of water to help our crops grow. They're a source of renewable energy. They support a wide range of businesses and jobs. Using the energy stored in the water, they're helping to keep our cities cool and our homes warm. Broadband cables, gas pipes, electricity lines tucked under towpaths and bridges traverse the country, bringing energy into our houses and businesses. And making this happen is one charity, a charity powered by millions of supporters, Canal and River Trust. We are the people making life better by water. We are the charity that provides much needed green and blue spaces in our most built up areas. We are the charity caring for these historic, precious and fragile structures out in the open, exposed to the very worst that our weather and climate can throw at them. We are the engineers, the lock keepers, the litter pickers, keeping these waterways open and bringing them to life for boaters, for local communities, for you. Our amazing charity cares for these wonderful waterways, but more help is desperately needed. Your donations, your time, as well as the vital support from partners and government if they are to survive and thrive. So we all have a back garden to call our own, a special place on our doorstep to use and enjoy. Together, we can make it happen. Together, we are Canal and River Trust, making life better by water.
So hopefully that sets the scene for just why the Canal and River Trust role is so important. But within that, water is the lifeblood of our canal network. If we don't get the right water supply in the right place, then we really do struggle to deliver all those things we've just seen on that video. I'll talk a little bit about the basics of canal hydrology, and many of you on the presentation this evening will be fully aware of where the water comes from, but some of you won't. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time explaining the complex interactions we have with our water supply system across the Trust's network. This diagram shows a few examples of where the sources of water are, how they move around, and perhaps helps people to visualize how we manage water. Another way of expressing it, and this is a slide I've used a few times, and probably, Roger, it may have been one I used 5 or 6 or maybe even 10 years ago, but it really gives a snapshot of the basics of canal hydrology and why the challenges are so complicated at times. When we look at our canal network, we talk often about summit pounds, and we talk about the challenge of putting water into the system. We've got around 70 reservoirs, 72 reservoirs that supply about half of our water resources overall across the Trust network. Some canals have lots of reservoirs, some canals don't have any reservoirs at all, but together they add up to about half of our water supply. Groundwater can be locally significant. That's water pumped from deep underground, and that does add up to only about 7% of our total water resources, but it's very useful, and it can weather the storm, so to speak, of droughts. If I'm mixing my metaphors a little bit there, because groundwater can be much more resilient in the face of periods of prolonged dry weather. We do rely heavily on what we call feeders. So those are streams and rivers that are pumped or fed by gravity into our network, and that adds up to over 30% or around a third of our water supply for the system that we manage. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the challenges we have with feeders in a few moments. We also benefit from what we call discharges into the system. So there are a number of places where we receive treated effluent and other runoff into our canal network. Sometimes we actually get revenue, we get money for receiving that water, and that can be particularly useful because where it flows into our system, that can be a useful source of water. Once it's in the system, water moves around with lock usage, so what we call lockage, and bypass flows, water passing around locks. But also in some locations we have back pumps, so we can recirculate water and move it back uphill to be used again for boat movements through the locks. And why are we doing all this? Well, the main reason is because canals use and consume water. So one of the biggest sources one of the biggest uses of the water is the losses. So our canals are 200, 250 years old. They're not always lined. The water does leak and seep through the bed of the canal. It always has and probably always will do. But on top of that, we get evaporation, we get vandalism, we can get boater misuse where paddles are left up and water goes to waste. We also have to supply water for abstractions, but we only do that where we've got surplus water. And if we're not using that water and it's not being lost through evaporation or some of the other leaks and seepages that happen, then excess water will eventually find its way back to rivers and streams via wasteways, or perhaps in the case of some canals, exit points into rivers and estuaries or docks. So this slide really shows some of the complex interactions and how we manage them on a day-to-day basis. One of the first things we do on a weekly basis is monitor what's happening with our reservoirs. So with those 72 reservoirs I talked about, every week we're recording the water level in the reservoirs. We're working out exactly how much water we've got in each reservoir from one week to the next, looking at that change over time. And we report that internally. We put it on our website once a month for interested individuals and organisations to look at, to see how our reservoirs are faring in the face of drought events. But also sometimes our reservoirs have to get drawn down for engineering works as well. The pumping that I talked about is a significant cost for the trust, and it's only going to get higher and higher based on the current energy prices and the energy crisis at the moment. So the map on the left shows where we've got our main pumping stations, and the larger the circles are, the more pumping we do. So there's a lot of pumping on the Kennet and Avon, there's pumping through the main Grand Union and the Oxford Canal, as well as a few other spots here and there scattered across the network. And those volumes of water are quite significant. So for those who know their canals, Chasewater Reservoir up near Wolverhampton is one of our largest reservoirs. We pump the equivalent of 28 times the volume stored in that reservoir every year with all of those pumps across our system. We've got about 60 pumps across the network, and that equates to over 50,000 Olympic swimming pools, and a lot of lockfuls of water are pumped around. And the amount of pumping we do changes from year to year. I'm not sure if this shows fully on the screen, but this is a snapshot of the different volumes of water that we pumped in different years. So when we get dry years, we tend to pump more water, and when we get wet years, we tend to have to pump less water around the system. And that reporting and that sort of monitoring of pump usage is very important, because the energy costs of doing this pumping are very significant. We spend about £2 to £3 million a year, and that's based on previous figures. The most recent year, once we get to the end of 2022, will probably be much higher because of the price of energy. So the reason to spend all that money is obviously to keep the canals at the water levels we need for navigation, and that's a critical part. And one of the things that the pumps do is they rely a lot on what we call Scada. So Scada is our supervisory control and data acquisition system. So in simple terms, it's telemetry. It's those little black boxes you can see on the two pictures at the bottom of the screen. Little black boxes next to the canal, scattered all over the place. 600 of these record water levels and flows, and they measure how many times locks are used. And we can get that data from the telemetry system onto our computers, onto our phones in real time. We can download it and we can look at that information. It also triggers automatic alerts and alarms. It tells our local teams if there's high or low water levels, or perhaps a failure in a critical piece of equipment. And it also controls sluices and weirs and pumping stations. So these things are operating 24/7, 365 days a year. They don't go on holiday. They're always there functioning, keeping an eye on the system. And what it looks like, an example here is what we call a screenshot of a mimic. So this is an example of what users can see. All these different data points coming in. You can see reservoir levels, you can see flows out of reservoirs, you can see canal water levels. And anyone in the trust can have a look at this data and can click on any of the points and see more information. You can see the trends of the long-term pattern of data, and you can configure the alarms and the settings all from the comfort of our laptops or our armchairs. And one of the things that we record through the telemetry system is the lock usage, so what we call the lockage, and we produce an annual lockage report. A lot of users find it's particularly interesting to see which are the busiest locks on the system. And we've got about 170 places where we record lock usage across the network. Although there's about 1,500, 1,600 locks, we don't have a lock counter everywhere, but we've got them on all the key lock flights. And the simple assumption is that if a boat goes through the top lock, it probably will travel all the way down through a lock flight. So if we measure the lock usage at the top lock, that's probably representative of the lock flight usage. It records hourly data, so we can get a real snapshot. We know which locks are being used at 5 in the morning on a lovely summer's day, or which ones are still being used at 10 o'clock at night on a summer's evening. And we've been producing this report now for 21 years. So pretty much my entire career of working with the trust, we've been producing this report showing that trend and that change in lock usage over the period. And one of the things we try and do is obviously help inform things like the lock gate replacement program, because those locks that are used more often are going to take more wear and tear, more bashing and battering with use, and will probably wear out more quickly. So Neil will talk later about how we do our inspection program and how we prioritise, and the lock usage data is one of the factors. it's a continual process, and again, Neil will talk about how many winter stoppages we do and how many lock gates or lock leaves we replace each winter, but it's somewhere around 120 typically. It varies from year to year. Leakage, lock gate leakage can really cause an impact on our water resources, and especially where we've got back pumps, it's very inefficient to be pumping water in a circle, just pumping water above the lock for it then to leak back through the lock gates. It's really important that we prioritise our investment in lock gates, particularly where we're incurring expensive back pumping. And like I say, the 170 lock counters basically give us a representative sample of our 1,500 locks. And in total, that adds up to over 4 million lockages per year. So all those lock gates are taking quite a pounding. And it's a great statistic in terms of how well the network is being used and enjoyed by boaters and boating taking place across the entire 2,000 miles that we care for. One of the things we can do with the lockage data is we can look at trends over time. So this graph shows a snapshot of weekly lock usage. So it's weeks 1 to 52, pretty much the whole calendar year. And we picked the 3 busiest sites in each of the Trust's 6 different regions. And I've put on there the different years over the last few years of lock usage. And it will come as no surprise that the red line was 2020, the year of the COVID pandemic starting. And you can see the impact of having to close our network, pretty much close it down through those periods from Easter right through into the start of the summer, and the massive impact it had on our lock usage. It's been a very considerable impact in terms of the total. There was a lot of what we call bounce back or recovery once the network reopened. And the next slide shows that a little bit in more detail. So this is the 2020 lock usage, and it's sort of subdivided into what was happening across each of our 6 regions. So the bars on the graph are the total lock counts across each of the regions. So as we were approaching Easter 2020, the lock usage was starting to increase, and then we suddenly went into that first very dramatic lockdown period, and the lock usage dropped right off. We then saw that post-lockdown period when navigation reopened, and particularly you'll see the grey dashed line where hire boat operators could freely operate from what we call week 27 onwards, and you saw this sudden step up and that pent-up demand for people to go boating and enjoy the network again, and that's really shown in the graph of the locks. So when we saw the summer usage go back to 14,000 lock counts per week, that was obviously great for the network to be back in use again after the difficult times of the first lockdown. But when it comes to managing water, whilst a lot of the work we have to do can be very reactive from one day, 1 week to the next, we also try and have a much more strategic approach. So there is a long-term plan. And what we've got in place and we're currently reviewing and renewing is our water resources strategy. So the last strategy we had was covering the 5-year period from 2015 to 2020. And it really set out for the first time for the Trust exactly how we manage water on a day-to-day basis, but also how we're looking at the long-term pressures on our water, things like climate change, and how that could really impact on our allocation of water. And we do that in our water resource strategy by subdividing the network into what we call hydrological units. So for those who understand how public water supply works, the average typical water company will break down its geographical area into water resource zones, and we call these for ourselves, we call them hydrological units. So we have 3 different types. So the classic river navigation, like the River Severn, for example, navigable River Severn are the green ones, and there's not a lot we can do to make more water flow in the big rivers of the UK. So the use of those locks is something which we have not a lot of influence over the total water resources allocation. The orange ones are what we call the river-fed system. So those are the parts of the canal network which rely on typically a primary or a single source of supply. So the Kennet and Avon relies a lot on the water that comes from the Bristol Avon down near Bath. And for those who know the Llangollen Canal up in the borders, it relies heavily on almost entirely on the flow from the River Dee at Lanticilio. So that's where those are the orange ones, a single dominant source of water. And then the really fun ones are the blue ones. Those are the ones where we've got multiple different sources of water. We've got the groundwater and the feeders and the reservoirs, and we can effectively play tunes with those different sources of water to try and get the right balance to make sure there's enough for navigation and ecology and all the other wider needs of the canal. And it's those blue ones that probably take the most time to carefully manage those resources during the summer months. And I touched on future pressures, and one of the big future pressures we face isn't just climate change, although that is probably going to be a very dominant or very significant impact. But something else that's taken a lot of our time and effort as a team and for the trust is something called the Water Act. And previously, the trust didn't need to have what were called abstraction licenses. These are the permissions granted by the regulator, so the Environment Agency in England, to take water from a stream or a river. And in our case, that's to feed into the canal network to meet the demands for water. We didn't need licenses, and we enjoyed that exemption for many years. But sadly, the Water Act 2003 replaced that exemption with a much more limited one. So our time was up, and we had to then basically apply for licenses because our abstractions were no longer exempt. So we needed permission from the regulators to carry on doing what we've been doing for 200 years. And there was a qualifying period. So we had to demonstrate that we had been taking water in the period from 2011 to 2017. And then we had 2 years to apply for licenses across England and Wales. There's a statutory deadline we had to comply with. And that was a lot of work for the trust to get those license applications submitted. And the regulators, so the Environment Agency in England, have had 3 years to determine the applications, basically judge whether or not we can carry on doing what we've always been doing going into the future, whether our use of water is sustainable. And this is a massive workload, and it's coming right to its culmination in the next few weeks. So the EA have had nearly 3 years now to issue all the licenses. We've had over 70 licenses granted to us to allow us to carry on abstracting, but there's still about 50 licenses that are going to land with us in the coming weeks in the run up to Christmas. So it's a very busy time for myself and the team, because every single license that lands with us, we have to then assess it and then comply with it. We have to make sure we are legally compliant with the conditions on that license. And that could include a restriction on how much water we're allowed to take, when we're allowed to take the water, how we record how much water we take to supply the canal network. So it's a significant extra burden for the trust. And it really does potentially affect our overall water resource reliability for the long term, because we are now part of this regulated licensed system. And those abstractions which are licensable are all over the country. There's about 155 applications that we've submitted. And in the data we prepared for those applications, we totted up how much water we typically took in the 7-year qualifying period. And I won't sort of try and confuse you with the terminology here, but basically the bars on this graph show variation in total average water abstraction that we took from streams and rivers to keep the canals topped up in those 7 years. And probably to put it in context, the easiest thing to do is put these 2 red lines on. The red line at the bottom of the graph, or towards the middle of the graph, I should say, is typically what Welsh Water supplied to all of Wales every day. So if you put a line across, it's about 800 or 900 million litres of water per day. And the line at the top is about roughly what Thames Water supplied to over 12 million customers across London and the South East. And our abstractions sit somewhere in between those two. So either all of Wales or much of the southeast of England. So that's how big an operator the trust is. That's how responsible we have to be, because the scale of our use of water is very significant. And it's no surprise that the regulators, the Environment Agency, are certainly asking lots more questions now they've seen this data set, just appreciating how large our abstractions are and how significant they can be, particularly in some catchments. So one of the things that Roger was keen that I talked about was recent issues. So I've hopefully set the scene around how complicated it is to manage water, but some of the recent issues we've faced with water resources have really been driven by the prolonged dry weather, the drought conditions we've seen this year. So the stats there talk about the warmest summer on record. It was the warmest year so far through the summer, and it was the driest year since 1976. And that really set the scene. And the bar graph on the bottom left shows for England all the different months from October in 2020 right through to September of this year. And every time there's a red bar, it means there was below average rainfall. And you can see we had month on month through this spring and summer below average rainfall, sometimes significantly below the average rainfall for the month. And only a few months in the last 24 have been above and well above the average rainfall. So that's really the driver for some of the water resource issues we faced. The maps on the right show just how dry it's been. So spring, the 3 months of spring, and then the 3 months of summer are shown on these two maps from the Met Office. And basically, the darker the brown means the drier it was, and it's expressed as a percentage of the long-term 30-year average. So you could probably say it's no surprise that we've had hosepipe bans for many millions of customers of the water companies in England and Wales, and why the Trust has faced some significant problems of water resources supply for our canal network. That driest summer since 2003, and in England at least, and so driest August, and as well as the driest summer, the hottest summer, the driest 7 months. There's plenty of superlatives and stats I've put on the page here. And really, August was an exceptionally dry month, and September also. Through October, we started to see some signs of recovery, which is very encouraging. But it's that prolonged dry weather that's really put a massive challenge onto the Trust in terms of supplying water to maintain navigation. How do we manage the impacts of drought? Well, obviously, all the things I talked about in terms of the monitoring and the computer network and our computer models can allow us to simulate what might happen. But as we've been going through the drought period, one of the first things we have to start to do is look, can we save water more dramatically? So bringing in lock usage restrictions, reducing the available opening hours for lock usage is one of the tools in our toolkit. And it sits alongside everything else in terms of the modelling and that coordinated management response. We have drought plans within the Trust that set out for each canal how we manage a particular drought event. And on the right, we've got our screenshot of the mapping that's available on our website now. And this is a screenshot from a few weeks ago. But it basically showed all the places where we had restrictions or closures to navigation. And in my 20+ year career, this has definitely been the worst summer in terms of the percentage of the network we've had to restrict or close due to the water shortages we've faced. And at its peak, we probably saw about 18% of the network was either closed or heavily restricted due to the water shortages. And closing the canals to navigation doesn't mean that we can then turn off the taps and not supply any water and just walk away and forget about it. We still have to maintain safe levels of boats to moor in our canal pans, even if locks can't be used. But also we've got the ecology and the biodiversity of the canals to think about as well. And we can't simply turn off the taps. Also, when we've got significant reservoirs, as the water levels get lower and lower in the summer months and we begin to run out of water, we then face problems in the reservoirs themselves because there's an ecology and a biodiversity in our reservoirs that can become really stressed with high temperatures and low dissolved oxygen, especially where we've got fish stocks in some of our reservoirs. And on the Leeds and Liverpool, for example, some of the reservoir holdings got down to as little as 10 or even 8% full. So we'd used over 90% of the water before it started raining in the last few weeks. An example of that is this, what we call our risk indicator graph of the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. So the dark black line with the blobs is the weekly water level, percentage holding for the Leeds and Liverpool reservoirs. So there's about 6 or 7 reservoirs that together supply the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. And you can see as we went through the year, starting week 14, which is around Easter time, as we went further through the summer, the reservoir holdings got lower and lower as we fed the water into the canal, as we would do every year. But the lack of inflows to the canal coming into the canals directly or into the reservoirs meant, along with the drawdown, that we were getting water levels lower and lower. Until we reached sort of the midsummer, we had to take the difficult decision to close the canal entirely. And when we did that, closing it to navigation and shutting up, ashing up, sealing up the lock gates also allowed us to reduce our demand for water. We could just about squeak through the remainder of the summer until we saw the refill that's showing in the last few weeks as the water levels have started to recover quite considerably. The different bounds on the graph are what we call our droughts or the trigger zones. So as the water levels in the reservoirs drop further and further, it gives us an indication based on historical computer model simulations of what the risk is that we're going to run out of water. So if the reservoirs are getting into the red zone very early in the year, then it's much more likely that we'll have to bring in closures and we face the prospect of running very short of water. By contrast, the Oxford and Grand Union system, so that is, as it suggests, the Oxford Canal and the Grand Union Canal primarily, as well as the Coventry and the Ashby canals, saw a much more gradual drawdown through the summer months, but it's only just in the last week or two started to see some of the green shoots of recovery in terms of the water levels starting to pick back up again. But the water levels didn't get quite as low, so they bottomed out at about 35% full, which is still not a lot of water left in those reservoirs as we got towards the end of the season. So that's a little bit about some of the challenges of not enough water. The flip side of the coin for the trust is what happens when we've got too much water and some of the challenges we face with flood risk management. And a lot of people think the canals don't flood. They think they're a man-made system, they're controlled, and they can never flood, never have problems. But I think these photos going back over the last 10 or 20 years just put that assertion to rest. That canals do flood, they can flood, and if there's excessive water entering into our canal system, either from direct rainfall or nearby rivers and watercourses coming into the canal system, it can cause significant problems for flooding of our network. And one of the biggest risks is what we call overtopping, so water overtopping into our system and then back out of the canal, and that can occasionally cause breach events. So again, we rely on these 3 M's, the monitoring, things like rainfall data, weather forecasts, and our Scada network to tell us where there's problems of high water levels, but also computer modeling to look at previous flood events and try and understand the risk and find out where we should invest more to make our system, our network more resilient. And then it's pulling that together in terms of the management, how we apply local knowledge, going back many years. A lot of our staff have been around a long time, passing that knowledge on, as well as working with other partners and agencies, capturing the information in our water control manuals, those operational guidance tools, and how we do things like surveillance, and we prioritize our resource based on which are the highest risk assets where we are most likely to have problems with excessive water levels. And not that long ago, we had something called Storm Christoph, and these 2 photos show just how quickly an event can move. So this photo on the left was taken on Wednesday, the 20th of January last year, so 2021, at about 4:18 p.m. So we'd had a weak spot in the canal, water level was overtopping, and it started to erode the canal bank away. At that point, we were suffering major flooding problems across a lot of the northwest of the country. Roads were impassable, couldn't get staff or vehicles or any plant or equipment out to a lot of our canals that were facing flooding problems. By the next morning, the canal had breached. The water had continued to flow. It had scoured out and eroded the base of that very thin piling. I don't think you'd even call it piling. And you ended up with a breach event. Thankfully, nobody was hurt in this event, but it did, of course, take us a little while and a significant amount of money to repair that breach from the Shropshire Union Canal. And also, you notice there was snowfall that night as well, so that was compounded. We had one of the worst storms in recent memory in that part of the country, in terms of excessive rainfall, and then it very quickly turned into a snowfall event as well, which made roads and travel very difficult for staff and emergency services. One of the questions that gets asked of the Trust quite a lot is, what can we do? What more can we do in terms of a role in relation to flood mitigation? Can our canals be more useful for local communities and provide storage in the event of flooding taking place? And so we've done some work to look at previous flood events, and we did a bit of analysis of a particular flood event that affected the Rochdale Canal, in fact, and we looked at how much water volume there would be in the canal if we could operate that top slice of the canal, perhaps 300 millimeters, if we could lower the water level by 300 millimeters in anticipation of a flood event, to create some storage or space for a flood event nearby, so the canal could perhaps mitigate the extent of the flooding. But what we found in that example, even dropping the water level in the canal by 300 millimeters, it had less than 1% reduction in the overall floodwater volume that took place in the nearby river. And in this case, in the Rochdale Canal, the river sits very close to the canal. So it's a negligible difference that it makes, but people often think that our canals could be somehow operated in a way that would provide huge amounts of flood attenuation. The reality is, in most cases, that's not possible. The canals were never designed to convey large flood flows. They don't actually have huge capacities when you compare them to the flow of water that happens in rivers and on floodplains. The other question that's asked a lot is, can our reservoirs do more to hold back water? And it's not just us that gets asked that question. Public water supply companies who have got significant sized reservoirs are always asked the same question: can their reservoirs act to hold back flood flows, to control the feed out of reservoirs and perhaps reduce the risk of flooding? And the short answer is yes, in theory, but a lot of our reservoirs are significant in terms of their age. So the average age of our reservoirs is over 200 years old. When you compare that to the water industry, their average reservoir age is about 120 years old. So our reservoirs predate the water industry, and the engineering that our reservoirs have underpinning them is of a previous generation in terms of civil engineering. And therefore, it would be much harder and certainly much more expensive to ever redesign and repurpose our reservoirs to provide that flood attenuation. But there are places where it does already happen. So take Brent Reservoir in northwest London. The reservoir level has been held down for many years, and that's one of the very few examples where we do this. And we've done it since the Second World War. And the reservoir is held down at a slightly lower level, and it provides a little bit of flood attenuation to the River Brent downstream. It makes a modest difference, but in significant flood events, the reservoir would still fill up once you get major inflows from a rainfall event. So in terms of flooding for us, recent issues and topics of interest, I just wanted to start to wrap up my part of the presentation by talking about our Todd Brook Reservoir. So for those who have been sort of following events in the Trust, in 2019, we experienced probably our biggest single infrastructure failure with Todd Brook Reservoir. That's up in the High Peak area at Derbyshire, and it's in the top of this photo. It sits above the town of Whaley Bridge, and the auxiliary spillway began to fail in the summer of 2019. And some of these images just show the scale of the event. Significant rainfall event generated a lot of flows coming from the catchment, and the auxiliary spillway initially did what it was designed to do, which is safely convey that water out of the reservoir, down the spillway and away to the River Goyt and through the town of Whaley Bridge. The problem was that after the event, which is shown on this graph, the scale of the event was so significant that it caused damage to the spillway. So the rainfall event was actually two distinct storm events. These are the rainfall bars on the top of the graph, and what we have on the blue line just appearing here is what we call the catchment flow. And it's expressed in a unit called cumecs, and cubic is a cubic meter of water per second. So another way of expressing that is 1 cubic is 1 ton of water every second. So at the first peak of the flood event, there was about 11 tons of water entering that reservoir every second. And then in the second peak of the event, it was over 14 tons of water every second through the peak of that event. And it was that significant volume of water coming into the reservoir that caused the auxiliary spillway initially to flow and then caused the damage to the spillway. And the spillway damage was quite apparent once the water levels began to subside. And after the event, immediately after the event, we could see just how bad the damage was. And this led to a significant emergency response from ourselves and many other partners and agencies to begin to lower the water levels, because the risk was that if another flood event took place, that spillway had been significantly compromised. And for those who were watching the BBC News at the time, the Army supported us with Chinook helicopters dropping bags into the spillway to try and shore up the spillway. Even Boris, remember Boris? He came along to get a photo opportunity as the event was still unfolding, whilst the RAF were helping shoring up the dam, the spillway, to avoid the problems. But in parallel, the activity we were doing was trying to divert the inlet of the reservoir. So you can see the Army, Royal Corps of Engineers were brought in to create a short-term temporary diversion weir at the inlet of the reservoir to send the water around the reservoir. We have a bywash channel, and you can see a small sluice there to the left of the reservoir, to the left of the image. And that feeder channel, that bywash channel, was designed to convey flows around the reservoir. So there's significant effort to shore up that bywash channel and make sure it could take significant flows to avoid water coming into the reservoir. And in parallel, the pumping operation began to lower the water levels as quickly as possible, because by lowering the water levels, we're able to reduce the pressure on the dam and create that much needed headroom, that storage of water in the reservoir in case another flood event was to come in, to try and avoid the likelihood of that spillway operating again, because we didn't know whether it could cope with another significant flood event passing water down the face of that concrete spillway. So we installed 11 major pumps into the reservoir with support from other agencies, including our contractors, and the fire brigade also installed their pumping to try and lower the water levels as quickly as possible. And basically what we did, we worked day and night to lower the water levels. So the reservoir level was dropped from full, so what we call zero, or top water level, down to about minus 11 meters, so 11 meters down from normal level to pretty much empty the reservoir over a period of days. And it was all throughout that period that the residents of Whaley Bridge, I think over 3,000 residents in the community of Whaley Bridge, were all evacuated from their homes. One of the largest peacetime evacuations that the UK has seen, because the risk of the dam failing was still there until we could lower the water levels. The drawdown rate that we managed to achieve is shown on the blue sort of dotted line graph just appearing there. So that as we installed the pumping and had to keep repositioning the pumps as the reservoir level got lower and lower, we were able to draw the reservoir down. And you can see that flow rate is still nowhere near what was coming into the reservoir in that flood event initially that triggered the failure of the spillway. But that was the best we could achieve to get the water level down as quickly as possible to safeguard the downstream community. So going forward, we ended up keeping the pumps in. They're still there now. They're monitored 24/7, and they allow us to keep the water levels down in the reservoir to stop the likelihood of the reservoir spilling. And we've now got a high-tech flood forecasting system in place. So this was delivered pretty much cutting edge. It takes hourly rainfall forecasts that we purchase from the Met Office, and it's from rainfall radar and from their forecasting supercomputers that basically tells us and projects what might happen in terms of inflows to the reservoir. And this graph shows a screenshot of what happened in that same Storm Christoph event. So whilst I showed what happened on the Shropshire Union Canal, the breach event, elsewhere in the country, we were facing significant risk of inflows to Todd Brook Reservoir. And we were forecasting, and bearing in mind the forecast runs from the red dotted line. So at that point, that was times T0, time of the forecast. It was projecting the blue line and all of the different grey lines of the sort of variations of the forecast in terms of what might happen in the reservoir in the next few days and how much water would be coming into the reservoir. And if you can see on the far right of the graph, we were forecasting between 10 and 12 cumecs coming into the reservoir. And you'll remember from the previous graph that when the event originally happened that led to the spillway problems, it was around 10 to 14 cumecs of inflows that led to the problem. So we certainly were very apprehensive at the scale of the inflows and what it might have meant. But the good news was, of course, we were starting with the reservoir much lower, so there was much more storage capacity in the reservoir. And so the computer model we've got, the forecasting tool we've got, ran a simulation using those inflows, using those flow calculations. And again, from that same T0 time of the red dotted line, we could simulate what was the likely water level change. So bearing in mind the reservoir is always held down at minus 12 meters, so 12 meters below full. The water level is kept down there by the pumps. The projections, all of these grey lines, including the blue line, was what we thought was most likely to happen. And hopefully you'll see a little red circle appear. That's the actual water level that was reached with the rainfall event that took place. So the model was projecting on at 7 a.m. on Tuesday morning. It was telling us by Thursday we would get to the blue line, and what we actually got to was the little red circle. So the model was absolutely spot on, and that gave us 48 hours confidence lead-in time of what the reservoir response was going to be. And the reservoir did come up from minus 12 meters to minus 8 meters in that very short space of time, even with these 11 pumps permanently running through the night and day to try and keep the levels down. The reservoir kept rising with the sheer volume of water coming in from the catchment. But it showed how reliable the modelling system was, and we've still got that modelling in place, and it's running every hour, night and day at the moment, and will continue to do so until the works on the reservoir are finished. And the reservoir situation now looks like this. We've had to start our major civils works on the reservoir. And these are images from last week as we start to reconfigure the dam and the spillway arrangement for the long term. So it's about a £15 million project, a construction project to deal with this for the long term. Significant re-engineering of the spillway arrangement. And my final slide should hopefully be a little fly through of what the works will look like. So hopefully you can hear and see this. I should say see this because there's no sound to this one. So the reservoir will look very different once it's completed, and that spillway that failed will no longer be there once all the work is done. I should also add that on top of the £15 million of this construction cost, the trust has spent several £million already in the last 2 years just installing those temporary pumps and continually monitoring the reservoir to hold it down at the minus 12 metre level. So those pumps already in there are permanent, or the semi-permanent addition that are going to be there until these works are completed, and then the reservoir can be allowed to refill. So that bypass channel that I showed in some of the earlier photos will basically join into this tumble bay. So the anticipated completion is still another couple of years away. So it just shows the scale of the re-engineering we're having to do just for one of our 72 reservoirs. So just wrap up my final slide. Hopefully I've put across a flavour of how complicated water management can be, and how we try and manage those extremes of drought and flood. And those recent experiences I've showcased just demonstrate only too well the challenges we face. And on top of that, the future pressures that we can expect into the legislation or climate change or funding will just add further to that challenge. But right at the heart of it is that technical expertise that we've got within the trust, within my team, but across a much wider organisation. And that's probably a good point to finish sharing and go back to Roger to take the next part.